Good morning to everyone in Asia, and good evening to those of you who are watching online in the United States. My name is Glenn Howard. I'm president of the Jamestown Foundation, and I'd like to welcome you to Jamestown's first ever virtual dinner chat. Our discussion tonight is about China-Philippine relations and the U.S. strategic calculus. We're delighted to present you with this discussion on a topic that is of renewed and growing importance. Just this week, the Philippine Coast Guard announced it challenged the Chinese warship that entered the country's territorial waters in the South China Sea near Maria Louis Bank. This area is a little less than 150 nautical miles off the coast of Palawan province. The incident occurred one day after the 5th anniversary of a landmark ruling by an international court of arbitration affirming Manila's rights to its territories in the South China Sea and declared most of Beijing's claims to the contested areas as baseless. China has never accepted this ruling and continues to pursue its claims, which are also disputed by Brunei, Malaysia, Taiwan, and Vietnam. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken took the opportunity of the tribunal ruling anniversary to reaffirm the U.S. commitment to defend the Philippines armed forces from an attack in the South China Sea under the terms of a 70-year-old mutual defense treaty. China has consistently intensified its aggression in the South China Sea, and tensions in the South China Sea have remained high. Although Duterte remains highly popular at home, his embrace of China and reluctance to criticize its maritime policy have opened him up to criticism, and even including recent rumors that Chinese influence may have played a role in Duterte's past political victories. The Philippines, in turn, has walked a fine line, and at times contradictory line between great powers in the Indo-Pacific as the region becomes a hot arena for strategic competition between the U.S. and China. Relations between both sides and the Philippines will be closely scrutinized. In light of these developments, I will now pass the baton over to Jamestown's China Brief editor, Elizabeth Chen, who will introduce our guests tonight and begin what will be a most interesting discussion. Elizabeth, the floor is yours.
Glenn, thank you very much for that. I'm just going to quickly introduce our speakers in the order they're going in. And then we're also going to leave a little bit of room for questions and answers at the end. So I will ask audience participants to just type any questions you have into the Q&A function, and we'll try and get to those if possible. Without further ado, first up is going to be Professor Renato Cruz de Castro, who is currently teaching at De La Salle University in Manila, where he holds the Dr. Aurelio Calderon Chair in Philippine-American Relations. He's had a long and distinguished career in both academia and government, and he writes a monthly column for the Philippine Star and Business World. He's frequently cited as an expert on the Philippines' defense and foreign policy and security relationships as well. Speaking next is going to be Derek Grossman, who once served as a China Brief editor, but is now a senior defense analyst at the RAND Corporation. Mr. Grossman's current research interests include China's relationships with Taiwan, Vietnam, Japan, India, Pakistan, the Pacific Islands, and the Koreas. He's also previously worked in the intelligence community for over a decade, in the U.S. intelligence community for over a decade. Lastly, David, who most recently served as Assistant Secretary for State for the Bureau of East Asian and Pacific Affairs up until the early part of this year. Before he was at State, Mr. Stowell directed the China Strategic Focus Group at the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command, and also had a 35-year career in the Air Force, which included multiple tours of duty as a linguist, fighter pilot, and commander in Japan and Korea. He also served as defense attaché at the U.S. Embassy in Beijing from 2011 to 2013. So without further ado, Renato, I'll let you take it away from here.
Okay, good morning for those who are here in Southeast Asia or Asia. Good evening for those who are in the East Coast. So my presentation would look at Philippine-China relation in terms of the broad strokes, and of course, focusing more on what happened this year. So my area of specialization is actually Philippine-U.S. security relations. So most of my academic works have been focused on our alliance. But of course, since 2001, you have the China factor coming in. You know, it coincided, of course, with the emergence of China and the fact that 3 Philippine administrations since the beginning of 2001, I'm referring to President Gloria Macapagal Arroyo, has basically taken into account what I would call this triangular relationship. So during the time of President Arroyo, she made this delicate balancing act. So he basically said that we will have to, you know, using Mao Zedong term, we have to walk on 2 rivers, or walk on two legs, I'm sorry. So then you have President Aquino, who really sided on the part of the United States. Now, of course, this is an unprecedented case with President Duterte, who basically pivoted to China and adopted what I call an appeasement policy. This appeasement policy is, of course, based on two caveats. Number one, you will have Chinese public investment. And number two, there's an expectation that you will have a moderation in Chinese behavior in the South China Sea. Of course, these two things never happened. China have not fulfilled its part of the bargain. So I'll focus more on the moderation of Chinese behavior in the South China Sea. And what we see, of course, since the Duterte administration is that you have cases of tensions between the Chinese and, of course, Philippine forces deployed in the South China Sea. I'll give you some cases. In April 2009, you have 275 Chinese vessels surrounding Pag-asa Island or Q2, when, of course, the Armed Forces of the Philippines started rehabilitating its dilapidated airstrip in that island. Then, of course, you have the sinking of a Filipino fishing boat in the Reed Bank in June 2019, where, of course, the crew members of that fishing boat were left by the Chinese fishing vessel that rammed their boat. Of course, there allegation that it was an operation by the Chinese maritime militia. Then of what happened last year on February 17, where you have a Chinese corvette pointing its gun director system against the BRP Conrado Yap, the Philippine ship BRP Conrado Yap, the most modern ship in the Philippine Navy's arsenal. And incidentally, this happened less than 2 weeks after President Duterte announced the abrogation of the Visiting Forces Agreement. And of course, the most recent one, which I'm going to focus, is of course the recent Winston Shoal or Winston Reed standoff, which lasted, of course, from March 20 to May, kind of long, similar to what happened, of course, in 2012 during the Scarborough Shoal standoff. But even before you have this Winston Reed standoff, you have, of course, the Philippines filing a diplomatic protest against China when the Chinese government passed the Coast Guard law. The Philippines is the only country in Asia, not even Japan, that filed a formal diplomatic protest, basically, of course, foreshadowing what would happen in March. So let's just give a very brief rundown of that incident. Of course, the incident began on March 20 when Defense Secretary Lorenzana announced the presence of 204 Chinese fishing vessels stationed at Winston Shoal, stationary, and they have been there since December 2020. They're all forming a sort of a phalanx. They're all tied together. They were not conducting any fishing, and of course, they're stationary. Immediately, it was assumed by a unknown government task force that came out publicly, the Task Force on West Philippine Sea, which was actually established even during the time of President Aquino. I was there, of course, September 2015. 2014, that task force was established in the aftermath of the Scarborough Shoal standoff in 2012. So it came out publicly and basically said, we have now a situation that might be akin to what happened on Mischief Reef in 1995 and, of course, Scarborough Shoal in 2012, where you have, of course, Chinese gray zone operation being conducted against the Philippines. Immediately, you have, of course, vigorous reaction from, of course, Secretary of National Defense, Secretary of the Department of Foreign Affairs, Secretary Locsin, who promised to file diplomatic protests against China every day, as long as the fishing vessels were there. And of course, you have the Coast Guard deploying its Coast Guard vessels, much to the joy of the Japanese government. Because if you remember, the Japanese government donated about 12 multi-purpose Coast Guard vessels, and they were never deployed by this administration until you had the Winston Shoal standoff. Much, of course, the delight in Tokyo that finally they're being used in the West Philippine Sea. They're being used to guard tourist spots in the Philippines, but not in the West Philippine Sea. So you have this vigorous action by, of course, the Coast Guard, the Navy, the Department of National Defense, and of course, the Department of Foreign Affairs. All the time, President Duterte was nowhere to be seen. Until around April, he came out, initially backing the Secretary of National Defense, who engaged the Chinese ambassador in Manila in a war of words. So he said, I'm supporting my Secretary of National Defense. Eventually, of course, a few days later, he started to get turned against his own Secretary of National Defense and Secretary of Foreign Affairs. First, he said, your actions could lead into a major conflict with China. This is something very dangerous. So he's basically undermining his own two cabinet members. Then, of course, the possibility of seeking assistance from the United States was raised by the Secretary of the spokesperson of the Department of National Defense, and even by the Department of Foreign Affairs. And of course, you have Duterte saying, no, we will not seek assistance from the United States. This would trigger into war. So you have a number of his pronouncements that basically went against his own cabinet members and basically emphasized the fact that no matter what happened, appeasement policy will be the order of the day. So, of course, eventually the standoff ended. But what are the 2 points that I would like to emphasize? Number one, of course, you have this increasing tensions between the Philippines and China in the South China Sea. Winston Scholl, and of course, recently, let's mention about that Coast Guard vessel driving away the Chinese warship. So this will happen, especially as, of course, the election period is happening. And what is also very apparent is the clash, what I call the dynamic clash happening within the Philippine government. You have certain cabinet members, certain agencies who are questioning the appeasement policy of the Duterte administration. And of course, you have President Duterte trying to stick with his appeasement policy. I think this is a key challenge for the Biden administration or for the United States. If it could tip the balance within that within the Philippine government. Secretary Lloyd Austin will be coming here. That would help. But of course, the crucial event that would possibly tip the balance will be next year's election. So I end my presentation here. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. Derek, if you want to go next.
Thanks. Yeah, and good morning or good evening or good afternoon, wherever you are. It's actually late afternoon here in sunny California, just sitting outside on my back porch. I want to kind of pick up where Renato left off. And since I'm sandwiched in between Renato and General Stillwell, and General Stillwell is going to be talking about more the U.S. side of things, I kind of want to serve as a bridge between talking about China and the Philippines on the one hand and the US and the Philippines on the other, since this is that triangular relationship that we're trying to frame it as. And so on the China-Philippines side, I mean, it's really just quite striking what's been going on since Duterte was elected back in 2016. I mean, he literally wanted to try to diversify the Philippines' foreign and security policy, right? And to diversify it away from an over-reliance on the United States. I mean, I think we all know that Duterte for decades, has shown an anti-American stance, and more recently, perhaps a pro-Chinese stance in his policies. And so one of the first things he did as president was he said, bye-bye Washington and hello Beijing. And there was, a lot of angst in the Beltway about this move and what it meant for the future of the alliance. But, you fast forward to today and what you've seen is Duterte has gotten absolutely nothing from bolstering his ties with Beijing. And in fact, you could, I think, easily argue it has been severely counterproductive to Philippine foreign and security policy. And so now let me give you a few examples. So one of the things that Duterte talked a lot about was we're going to get money through China's Belt and Road Initiative to build up, to invest in the Philippines and build up infrastructure in the Philippines. And to date, very few, if any, of those projects have really amounted to much. Now, we could debate about why that is. Some say that it's because of legal restrictions in the Philippines, right? But others say, well, actually, China has not done well in terms of providing the requisite funds and bringing its workers there to actually break ground on a lot of these projects. So there's some debate about it, but regardless, Duterte's got nothing on BRI practically. When you look at the potential for a joint exploration deal between China and the Philippines. Now, this is in the disputed part of the South China Sea. Duterte had said, don't worry, we're going to get a joint exploration deal in place with China regardless of our sovereignty disputes. We'll patrol the waters together in order to extract natural resources there. Hasn't happened, and it's not going to happen. It's pretty obvious between now and the end of Duterte's tenure in June of next year that there's practically no chance of that happening. I think we would all be stunned if it did, because things have gotten so bad per everything Renato was just talking about in the South China Sea. And let's focus specifically on, some of the backtracking, frankly, that Duterte's had to do with the South China Sea, because, every morning you wake up and you see his statements. I mean, sometimes he'll say, we're going to, I'm paraphrasing here, but we're basically going to fight to the death against China in the South China Sea if it comes to that. But then the next morning you wake up and he says something akin to, you know what, China can just have the South China Sea. There's nothing we can do about it anyway, so why even try? I'm paraphrasing, but that's essentially the gist of kind of the pendulum swings here that could literally make you nauseous. And I think that a lot of that is because he just doesn't know what to do. And he doesn't want to look like he's cozying up to his decades-long partner in the United States, because again, he is anti-American. He talks all the time about American colonialism back in the early 1900s. He talks about Scarborough Shoal more recently in 2012, when China essentially, annexed Scarborough Shoal from the Philippines and the United States. It did not trigger the Mutual Defense Treaty, and now China de facto controls Scarborough Shoal. So Duterte will bring that up and say, look, we can't trust the United States. US commitment is basically trash to us. And so this has come up very recently in the last couple of days with the SecDef visit, with SecDef Austin going to the Philippines. Lorenzana, the defense secretary in the Philippines, talked about how the VFA, the Visiting Forces Agreement, will remain intact, but there will be an addendum to it. And now there's kind of there's like a huge swirl about, well, what's going to be in that addendum? I have a feeling it's going to be about Scarborough Shoal, because Duterte has publicly aired that out in the last few weeks, saying the United States simply cannot explain to us in any rational terms why they abandoned us at the Scarborough Shoal. So I've been very sort of public about this in my writings and what I've said to the media. Yeah, I think Duterte at the end of the day has no other choice but to partner with the United States to offset China's growing military power in the region. When he looks at Scarborough, he doesn't want to have another Scarborough happen on his watch. And so the way to ensure that that doesn't happen is to allow the Philippine defense establishment, which is overwhelmingly pro-American, to continue to engage the U.S. military in joint trainings and in all kinds of other activities, procurement of weapons systems and the like. I mean, we saw, I think the other day, that the Philippines is going to buy F-16s. Now we'll see if they can afford them, but these types of things, I think, these trends in the U.S. Philippines alliance, I think, will continue in a positive direction, regardless of what Duterte's policy is on China. Now, on the U.S. side, I will just say that it's been very interesting with the Visiting Forces Agreement, because as we all know, in February 2020, Duterte decided to terminate the agreement, but luckily there was a 180-day waiting period before that could happen. And within those 180 days, the Philippines came back in June of last year and postponed termination of the agreement for the first time. And then in November 2020, postponed for the second time. And then in last month, postponed for a third time. So the VFA looks like it is here to stay, perhaps through the remainder of Duterte's 6-year term. I think when you look at some of the language that came out during those postponements, it's very interesting. So in June 2020, the language gave two reasons for it. One, the pandemic, and there's a lot of uncertainty surrounding the pandemic. So we better, keep the VFA intact, at least for now, because it could help us down the road. And the second was sort of a generic great power competition, not naming China. Okay. Then in July of last year, for the first time under the in the Duterte administration, the Philippines Department of Foreign Affairs publicly acknowledged the arbitration ruling in 2016 in Manila's favor. That's something that Duterte was always loath to do, but he apparently gave authorization to the Department of Foreign Affairs to do that. And then in September of last year, when he gave a speech at the United Nations General Assembly, I think it was right before Chinese President Xi Jinping as well, he said that the arbitration ruling was a fact and could not be overturned, and that the Philippines was going to go full throttle on supporting that ruling. I mean, this was really groundbreaking stuff for a man who, for 4.5 years prior to that, had just talked glowingly about Beijing and very negatively about Washington. And then in November 2020, during the second postponement of the VFA, China was specifically named as of deep concern to the Philippines. And then, of course, you had the Whitsun Reef saga that Renato just very accurately went through over the last few months. And so what was interesting is in the third postponement of the VFA last month, the Secretary of Foreign Affairs, Teddy Luxon Jr., did not mention China, but I think it's pretty clear from conversations that Luxon and Secretary of State Tony Blinken have been having, as well as Secretary of Defense Austin has been having with Defense Secretary Lorenzana, that China really is kind of at the forefront of both countries' minds right now. And so I think with Secretary Austin visiting the Philippines as part of a 3-country tour next week in the region, we're going to see a lot of conversation about China come out after that. So I think the alliance, let me just finish by saying there's a lot of folks out there who say that the alliance is in grave condition. I'm not one of them. I actually think that these 3 postponements essentially prove the point that the Philippines doesn't have anybody else to rely upon except the United States, and can even weather an anti-American president like Duterte, because China poses that much of an existential threat to the Philippines. With that, I will turn it over to General Stillwell. Thank you.
Well, Derek, thank you for that. And Renato also for laying the groundwork, making my job easy. I just have to nod and go, yep, I agree with all of those things. But maybe I can add a little bit of granularity to what the thought process was back in the Beltway during the most recent 2 years. And then being military, I had the good fortune of actually serving in the Obama administration in the Pentagon as well. So I can offer some of the thoughts from 2012 and then 2016 as well. So I would note, just to kind of chapeau this whole thing, I was at the 2014 Shangri-La dialogue, and it was the first time we took them on straight on. It was Wang Guanzhong versus Chuck Hagel, where we both sort of aired grievances. And the headlines from the Straits Times at that time said, China for prosperity, U.S. for security, basically saying we don't have to choose. We can get the best of both deals just by maintaining positive relationships with both. And I believe that's been the general attitude from ASEAN and others all along, is if you do choose, you stand to lose one way or the other. I would say you stand to lose much more from the Chinese side. The U.S. doesn't tend to, toward retribution as much as Chinese do. But the point is this idea of don't make us choose, prominently from the Singapore side. You hear that a lot, but others also manifest that. And so you have to ask the question, what is the choice that we're asking these folks to make? Well, if you look at what China's main weapons in all of this is, and it's not military. I mean, they can overwhelm Scarborough, and they can definitely overwhelm smaller bilateral partners. But what they use is economic leverage, and that economic leverage is difficult to resist. The U.S. offers long-term security guarantees, but the immediate economic damage from Chinese use, as we've seen with Australia and others, clearly, China, Philippine exports rotting on the docks and other things, that has immediate effect and a political effect for folks like the Philippines. And so this is why State Department and my bureau floated the idea a while back of something of like an economic Article 5, where if we boycott Australian table wines or we put 212% tariff on those wines, that the rest of the free market world would just accept buying a little bit more Australian wine to offset the loss, to remove that threat from the Chinese side. This would be a big benefit to the Philippines, if they could just shift markets away from the PRC for a time to take away this economic cudgel that China's uses so well in this prosperity versus security construct. So that's going to take some time for that to come to fruition. So in the meantime, what we did at NEAP during that was we took some solid stands to reverse some of the bad decisions and the bad policy initiatives out of DC during my time when I was in the Obama administration. We already mentioned Scarborough, but then there's the Tribunal of Law on the Sea, which we did encourage the Philippines to do. And yet when the tribunal announcement took place, we had folks in the past administration walk away from it and say, let's just turn the page. We can be friends, China, and all the rest, leaving our friends in the Philippines twisting in the wind, as we would say. These are difficult decisions to bounce back from. From Manila, I'm sure it all looks like something DC would do. Now, I'd ask my friends in Manila to look at what the Trump side did in terms of clarifying and simplifying alliance relationships. Some would say it was more transactional, but that simplicity and clarification made it easier, I think, to negotiate and maneuver. I mean, if you use the NATO example of how Trump treated NATO, and I completely agree that if you sign up to 2% of your GDP to deter and to send a strong deterrent message to the primary foe, in this case, the Russians or Soviet Union, if you don't maintain that 2% commitment, do we have an alignment? Do we have an alliance? Do we have an agreement? I mean, these things are based on mutual benefit. And the same would apply in the Trump administration's approach to alliances in Asia Pacific. So what we did in that case to sort of regain credibility and then to follow up on a very fortunate outcome from the tribunal was in July of 2020, we changed the policy to reflect that China's maritime claims are completely illegal. That's what UNCLOS said, and we aligned our policy with that. What that did was it gave the Philippines full claim of its EEZ, all the resources inside its EEZ, and then also gave credit to the tribunal ruling and supported the Philippine side. Hard to erase the back and forth of varying political sides in the U.S. over time. So again, I can sympathize with Manila and others. But if you look at actions over the last 4 years, for sure, and I think these will continue with Secretary Austin's trip, I think we've demonstrated that consistency in policy will make these alliances more difficult on both sides, and then we can expect the other side to contribute more simple things like a VFA and the rest. I'll close, though, with one last thought. It's a bilateral treaty, right? But security in the region is based on multiple parties. When more than one party, I mean, the Philippines versus China is no contest. The U.S. and the Philippines versus China is a better contest. But ASEAN and the U.S. versus PRC malfeasance in the region is that's a winning hand. So would eventually hopefully discuss the ability for this trip to Vietnam, Singapore, and Manila to stitch those together into a single coherent regional approach. I'll stop there. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, everybody. Going off of your last comments, General Stillwell, one of our audience members has asked maybe for the other panelists to elaborate a little bit more on why there hasn't been a stronger collective response from ASEAN against Chinese aggressions in the South China Sea, and if you think there is room for that to change, considering that sort of those aggressions have continued and in fact sort of ramped up.
So the question is directed to whom?
Yeah, if you want to go ahead and answer. Yeah, sure.
Well, one reason is ASEAN is divided since 2012. In Cambodia, China has effectively divided ASEAN. So you have the continental states that are, of course, aligned with China because of geography and, of course, their economy. Then in the maritime Southeast Asia, you also have a division between what I call those who are fence-sitters and, of course, countries that have the potential to challenge China. I'm talking about, of course, Vietnam, Indonesia, and, of course, the Philippines. In the case of the Philippines, you see that division. You have certain sector in the government here who wants to align our policy in competition with Cambodia to be China's best friend. And, of course, you have the other side that's challenging China. So that's the point. That's why ASEAN could not come out with a collective response, because when it comes to the South China Sea issue, it's divided.
Yeah, I think I totally agree. I mean, I think there's no way in the current state of ASEAN for ASEAN to collectively push back against China for all the reasons that Renato outlined. And I mean, just look at what's going on with Myanmar. I mean, they cannot get into an agreement on Myanmar because each of the countries have different interests. And, you know, they have this 5-point consensus that has essentially ground to a halt. And it's not even really that controversial of a consensus. Basically that, you know, one of the main points is that the two parties should continue to speak. The Tatmadaw, you know, the military that's now ruling Myanmar, and the civilian government. And they can't even really facilitate those types of negotiations. And so let alone to deal with China. And, you know, I think the code of conduct is the perfect example of this. I mean, it's been going on for now like 20 years almost, and there's been no agreement. And, you know, that's because, for one thing, China tries to kind of divide the different ASEAN members from each other on developing a code of conduct in the South China Sea. And another is China has the preponderance of power and can, you know, take on one or multiple of the ASEAN maritime counterclaimants militarily if it needed to. And they know that. And so it's, you know, it's really hard for ASEAN to figure out a way to deal with China in a cohesive manner.
Okay, thank you very much. Next question from the audience. I guess, again, for Renato, who do you think would be who's the strongest presidential candidate right now that would reverse most of Duterte's appeasement policies towards China? Or do you think he's going to continue to have influence going forward? I know there's been a little bit of discussion about, you know, he mentioned recently he wanted to potentially run for vice president or something like that. So.
I would say the most powerful, but basically you have three parties that have already indicated their interest and they'll run. Number one, of course, is Duterte's anointed successor, which happened to be his daughter, the mayor of Davao City, which doesn't have that string of anti-Americanism compared to his dad. For one thing, of course, her mother is an American citizen. The wife of President Duterte, the former wife, and even the current partner are American citizens. So that's a funny thing about President Duterte. He's surrounded by American citizens. Even his daughter is an American citizen who was born in California. But for one reason or the other, he has this personal. So he has this anointed one, of course, her daughter. It's supposed to be the strongest right now because, you know, there's supposed to be an assumption that Duterte's popularity could be inherited. That, of course, challenges conventional political science wisdom. Charisma could not be inherited, could not be passed. Second, of course, is someone who is right now in Las Vegas, who has been pushed out of his political party as the president. And I'm speaking no less than Manny Pacquiao. So he has already indicated. That's why he was ousted from the PDP Laban. Then you're supposed to have the alternative. The current Senator Lacson, does he ring a bell? The former police chief during the time of President Joseph Estrada, and of course the Senate President, Vic Soto. Then of course you have some Bayan, which not yet have fielded a political candidate, but of course is eyeing to push a single opposition candidate that will of course challenge Duterte. So it's at this point in time, it's really difficult to say who would have the great, the most chance of winning this election. Just like, American election, you simply don't know what will happen next. And for one thing, of course, we pattern our system from you guys.
Glenn, do you want to
can I just ask Renato a question actually on that? Does Sarah Duterte share her father's pro-Chinese perspectives on things?
Not necessarily. In fact, when President Duterte abrogated the visiting forces agreement last year, Sara Duterte was in Washington, D.C. She was on the leadership program of the State Department, used to be called the International Visitors Program. And she was recalled back to Manila, and she was not very happy. And she declared, if I'm on the same shoes as my dad, I will befriend everyone. I will not take side. Taking a dig at her father.
I had a quick question I wanted to ask Dave Stilwell. And General Stilwell, you have briefed a lot of people in your course of your career. And if you were in the room briefing Austin before he went to visit the Philippines, what would you have advised him? What would you have said to him in terms of your experience in dealing with this area? I'm sure you've got done a lot of reflection on that, and what would be your 2 cents to give him?
That's a really good question, and there's parts of that answer I would keep behind closed doors, but I would. There's a practical aspect to that. Let me just put it this way: I would advise him that President Trump's response to the VFA abrogation in February 2020 was absolutely the right response. When he got wind of that, the president said, "Hey, it's a sovereign country. They can do what they want. ... Besides, it will save us money." That was the response. I think the response back from Manila to that said, as I said, this relationship has 2 sides to it. It can't be one-sided, right? And if you expect the U.S. to come to your aid in terms of defense, we've got to have the ability to operate, and we have to be able to have the ability to train. And these things all relate to a visiting force agreement, EDCA, all the rest of those things that we're talking about. So you don't do these things in public because that force is bad. You've got to look strong to your own people, but at the same time, you can't let personal preferences and this counter-colonialism history and all those things take you away from the realism of the day, the threats of the day. So maybe I would offer an inside and outside voice on that. So when the doors are closed and have that conversation, offer some real politic here and say, what does the U.S. get from this? That'd be probably the number one.
Okay. Charles Ludlow asks for all 3 presenters. China appears uncharacteristically to be pushing an aggressive strategy with prospects for armed conflict in the SES. It also appears that China is on a timetable of some sort. Both of these are historically not typical Chinese approaches. Do you think this strategy will backfire in the long term?
Okay, I'm unmuted. Let me just answer that quickly. So we just finished the first centenary, the 100-year establishment of the party back in 1921. Xi Jinping, when he came to power in 2012, 2013, offered a different China, a confident, positive, and as you mentioned, timeline China. China has things to accomplish. But at the same time, China has annoyed its neighbors considerably. Renato, I appreciate your concerns about Mekong ASEAN, but from where we sat, we were able to get a lot of mileage from the 5 Mekong members, just in terms of abuse of a major water resource and downstream rights. And we held a water, rivers conference and these other things that there was some very vocal participation on the code of conduct negotiations. You've seen that they've done what ASEAN does best, is they've basically obfuscated and slow rolled what China went from being, let's not get it done right away. If you remember in 20, China said, let's get this done in the next 3 months. And ASEAN did a very good job with Vietnam at the lead of slowing that down into something more reasonable. So, China can be as aggressive as it wants, but it can't take on all 5 or 10 or whatever ASEAN countries at the same time, nor can it take on the whole world in the pandemic. I think is another issue that we eventually need to talk about, is what that's done to Chinese position in the world. Suddenly, this fuzzy panda idea and the fact that the American malfeasance is the cause of all evils is no longer resonating. So we should all work together to get through the pandemic together. Renato, you mentioned donations of vaccines to the Philippines and others both through COVAX and just straight bilateral transfer, while the other side is selling Sinopharm and Sinovac. So yes, aggressive, possible timetable, backfire, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you look across the Indo-Pacific, Chinese assertiveness is not appreciated anywhere. I mean, there's just so many, there's literally so many examples of it now, it's hard to keep up. Whether you're Japan or you're Australia, you're the Philippines, right? Taiwan, and now high in the Himalayas against India. I mean, the list just goes on and on of kind of self-made crises that China's engaged in. And will it backfire? I tend to think yes. But then again, a lot of it depends on what we do in the United States. If Duterte has one important point that I think we all need to take away here, it is the Scarborough Shoal more than anything else, because, we could argue through legal machinations, why the Mutual Defense Treaty wasn't triggered when China took over Scarborough Shoal. If that helps us sleep at night, great. All right, but it does not help an alliance, all right, when a country's de facto territory is taken over by another country and we do nothing. All right, so, and it's not just the Philippines. In my conversations across the region with interlocutors, they always bring up Scarborough. Always. How can we possibly trust the U.S. military commitment to the region when that happened just recently? And then, of course, in 2017, we have, President Trump deciding to withdraw from the Trans-Pacific Partnership. That's another thing now, not military, but another component now, the economic component of the U.S.'s position and sustainability in the region being put into question. So, I think we need to kind of do more in the region to show that we care. I mean, I will tell you one thing and by the way, the Biden administration is not immune to this. I'm not trying to pick on the Trump administration, but President Biden is yet to speak directly on the phone with any Southeast Asian leader. Zero. We're 6 months in. Okay. Now you could say we're dealing with COVID. We're dealing with economic recovery. We're dealing with lots of other things, right? But to not pick up the phone and talk to at least one Southeast Asian leader is not, it just shows that you're not paying attention to the region enough. And so that kind of feeds into the angst and concern that Southeast Asian countries have. And why not remain non-aligned? If you can't trust the United States and you can't trust China either, so just try to maximize your benefit from both and hope that they don't go to war.
Building off of that, I think one of our audience members asks, is there an alliance dilemma or maybe a perceived alliance dilemma that the U.S. is reluctant to back its friends and allies because it fears being trapped into a conflict with China over small features in the SCS?
I guess that would be me. I don't think so. I mean, I think in the last administration, we came out pretty strong in favor of being clear on where the Mutual Defense Treaty does apply and does not apply. And they said it twice during that time. And so there's definitely a commitment there. I think what he's describing is this idea of a commitment trap, where by committing to, defend anything, it enables the other partner to take action that may not have been advisable or put you in a position you don't want to be in. And I mean, that's always a consideration, but I think the solution is just constant interaction and conversations. The military conversation is important, but the military guy here is going to lose all his friends when he says it's the diplomatic relationship that's far more important. And I do think, from what I could tell, that Sung Kim and our diplomatic presence and conversations, both in DC and in Manila, were very productive. For my part, I had some a lot of productive conversations with Ambassador Maldez and the embassy there. So it's a long way of saying, yeah, I mean, commitment trap's an issue, but if you're in close coordination, I think it's not something you have to think about or worry about.
Okay, and then on the other side, going for the econ question, this was directed to General Stillwell, but I think it could be opened up to whoever wants to respond. Do you think it's likely we can, do you think it's possible rather that we can reconstruct the TPP? And would this, at this late point in time, be helpful in countering China's sort of economic leverage in the region?
In an ideal world, yeah, it would be great to get back on that TPP bandwagon. But see, the problem is, first of all, TPP doesn't even exist anymore. It's now the CPTPP. All right. And second of all, bipartisan, the extreme polarization in this country politically, I think makes it very difficult to get that kind of deal done and through the Congress. And, it's not just, one side or the other. It's both sides, the extreme ends of both the Democratic and Republican parties. So, because progressives in the Democratic Party, they want to keep American jobs here. And they're going to be worried about if the U.S. signs up for the CPTPP, assuming we're invited in, right? Then that might mean that American jobs are going overseas. But then the kind of like pro-Trump Republicans on the conservative side, they actually want the same thing because it's America first to them. So, I think it would be extremely difficult for us to get back into now the CPTPP.
Jump in. This is where I believe the Quad enters the picture. Quadrilateral security dialogue, and of course, especially the role of Japan. So it's not China that has invested in the Duterte administration build program. It's Japan. The largest infrastructure projects here in the Philippines are all funded by the Japanese. So this is where Japan enters the picture, especially when you talk about investment and even trade. And of course, you can bring in also Australia and to a certain degree, South Korea. The challenge for trade in the Philippines in particular and Southeast Asia in general is what I mentioned earlier, diversification. That we won't have China as our our only customer at the end of the day. From the perspective of Washington, Southeast Asia is still far away. But for Japan, South Korea, Australia, and even India, Southeast Asia is just in their neighborhood. This is where I would believe that Quad would play a very important role. The Quad would play a very important role.
Here is another question for Dr. De Castro. Can you walk us through the internal government debate that has led to Manila's decision to begin talking about the tribunal publicly? And what do you think the key factors were in having the administration make that big change?
Number one, of course, the appeasement deal is based on two caveats, which I earlier mentioned. China's money would enter, and of course, you have, the hope that China would moderate their behavior. This did not happen. The administration went through with this until, of course, you have only one person, of course, that has been opposing the appeasement policy, and that's, of course, Secretary Lorenzana, because he has been there since 2016. It was the military that basically asked President Duterte after he came back from Beijing in October 2016, what do you mean by separation? So President Duterte had to make some steps back. He said, separation doesn't mean severing the ties. Then, of course, you remember what happened in Marawi, 2017, where, of course, the Armed Forces of the Philippines realized its limitation in terms of logistics, reconnaissance, and sure enough, of course, you have American forces providing reconnaissance plane, and this strengthened basically the pro-American element in the Philippine government, especially in the Armed Forces of the Philippines. Then, of course, you have Secretary Locsin becoming the Foreign Secretary around 2018, 2019. He made a lot of difference. Now you have two key cabinet members who are basically taking the cudgel for the security relationship. Secretary Lorenzana and, of course, Secretary Locsin. So they've been trying to man the port, despite President Duterte's effort to slowly, incrementally unravel the alliance. So this is the dynamics going on. And of course, this dynamics will become more intense as the election period comes closer. You'll have a lot of senators, you have a lot of, cabinet members who will start questioning President Duterte because he's practically right now a lame duck president. And of course, as election period comes, you'll have again a change. So again, this is the dynamics of any liberal democracy. I hope, I made it clear.
Okay, so going into that security relationship a little bit more, one of our audience, Rob Knight Jr. asks, do you think the U.S.-Philippine strategic relationship can be strengthened with additions to a modified visiting forces agreement treaty, one that possibly increases U.S. use and partnered upgrades of ports and bases within the Philippines and West Philippine Sea to ensure a better strategic posture against China's gray zone tactics? Would this step be necessary to hold China accountable for going against international rule of law and norms in the region, according to the tribunal decision?
Well, an agreement like that, anything you can do to, jointly state a commitment to this mutual defense can't hurt. I mean, it can only help. To Renato's point earlier, and to Derek's point, more so, the Japan and other allies aspect, the Quad and other things, is something that is under stated as well, that could use a little more emphasis. Japan is a great silent partner in all of these things, in mainland Southeast Asia, in the Philippines, and other places. So again, Renato, thanks for bringing that up. That helps. And it's like-minded. They're a security partner. They're obviously an ally of the U.S. as well. This is what my old boss, General Marty Dempsey, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, noted, that we got to get out of this hub and spoke alliance process that we've been talking about. And this goes to the question, and move toward more of an alliance network where you're all focused on the same issue. Therefore, the U.S. doesn't have to be the center actor in all of this. We're all pretty much pulling in the same direction. We should take advantage of that. And again, a Philippine-Japan alignment or cooperation would be a great outcome. That's a message. In addition to things like visiting forces, EDCA, and exercises, and all the rest. All of these things matter.
Okay,
I just think the United States is trying to hold on to the VFA until Duterte's gone, and then maybe we wouldn't have to worry about it anymore. An upgraded VFA is almost unthinkable at this point. I think just keeping it intact is what is the goal right now, and I think that's a respectable goal given the circumstances. And post Duterte, maybe it's possible to bring back the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, the EDCA, that General Stilwell was just talking about. And then that would allow the United States to pre-position troops and equipment at 5 different bases throughout the Philippines to deal with potential contingencies in the South China Sea or elsewhere. So, but you have to have the VFA first in order to get the EDCA. You can't get one without the other, because it's very difficult then to get troops in and out of the Philippines without the VFA. So, my 2 cents.
If I may, of course, at this point in time, we look at the alliance in terms of an alliance of necessity. From the perspective of the United States, we need each other because of the China challenge. The long-term challenge of the alliance, of course, is to transform it from an alliance of necessity to an alliance of choice. We have the security partnership because we have long historical ties. We have this alliance because we're both liberal democracies. We have this alliance, and this is something I also emphasized and something I experienced when I studied there in the States for 6 years. We have this very, long and intense trans-Pacific partnership. I'm talking about 2 to 3 million Americans who, of course, trace their heritage here in the Philippines. I'm talking about the Filipino-American community. That's something that has not been emphasized in this alliance. So every Filipino family has an American relative. I remember when Harry Thomas was here, Ambassador Harry Thomas, and he had a discussion with the Chinese ambassador then. The Chinese ambassador said, every Filipino has a Chinese blood in his veins. Ambassador Harry Thomas said, every Filipino family has an American relative. So this is an aspect of the relationship or the alliance that we have not explored into. So, that's my point. How can we transform this? Because the China challenge will be a long-term challenge. So this alliance should be made durable by making it an alliance of choice, not simply a matter of an alliance of necessity.
Okay, I think we've got time for one more question. So from Yo Kikuchi asks, what kind of implications can we expect from recent movements of European states sending naval vessels to the SCS? And are these seen in a positive light by the Philippines? So if you could just answer that.
Can you maybe, I'm sorry, repeat the question?
Oh, yeah. So asking, I think talking about like British and Germany and France sending ships to patrol in the SCS. What implications does that have for the Philippines? And are they seeing it maybe in a positive light or?
Well, I'll let Renato talk about how the Philippines is seeing it. But I mean, from an American perspective, it's got to be very welcomed, right? I mean, because if the Quad is really the centerpiece of American foreign policy in the Indo-Pacific, and the Biden administration has more or less said that, that is a group of like-minded democratic countries. So if you have more like-minded democratic countries coming in to uphold a rules-based international order, in this case, specifically in the South China Sea, I mean, that can't be a negative thing, I don't think, from the U.S. perspective. But I wonder what Renato thinks about the Philippines.
Regarding the visits of British, generally it's sort of apathetic attitude regarding it. The focus is still on U.S., Japan. It's because it hasn't happened yet. It's just an announcement of Britain that will be sending its carrier battle group into the region. Then Britain would be maintaining 2 warships in that area. Germany would be sending a frigate. Point here is, so what? Will they make a difference?
Maybe too early to tell on that. Well, we're coming up on 9 o'clock, and keeping in mind that all of our participants are calling in from very different time zones, I wanted to thank you all again for this great discussion. Also, thank you to all of the audience for their great questions. Hopefully we can continue this debate, and I'm sure we all have plenty to think about. So thanks again, everybody.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Bye, General. Bye, Direct.
Yeah. Bye, Renato. Bye, General. Bye. Bye.
Okay, never mind. Good.